Good morning. When we left off our examination of Giotto's Arena Chapel yesterday, I wanted to return directly with the scenes devoted to the life of Christ. These are the majority of scenes in the Arena Chapel. You're looking again toward the altar end of the chapel. And the scenes from the life of Christ occupy the middle tier and the bottom tier on both walls. Two scenes are somewhat clear here, even in foreshortening, and you'll see them again. One of them is the flight into Egypt, here on the right hand or south wall. And in the middle tier opposite it, you find at least part of the baptism of Christ. And so we will see these in context as we move through the interior of the Arena Chapel. Again, here is the altar wall, the arch, triumphal arch, which includes God the Father enthroned at the top and the angel annunciate at the lower left, and the Virgin Mary in her cubicle, her room, here on the right. I show you those two figures in detail now. The angel on the left, and I don't think I showed you this in detail before, and I want you to appreciate how the space is a shallow but credible space because of those projecting little balconies upon the small room. And also you'll notice the way that is tilted toward the right. It's set up in a kind of perspective from where you would see it if you were standing in the middle of the chapel, whereas on the opposite side the architecture tilts inward from the right where Mary is. In both cases, there is this little curtain, which you may have noticed in the one on the left, which is in partly from a rod or a post and partly hanging out of the, or into the little turrets or balconies there. Almost as though they had been drawn back, small as they are, to reveal the arch and the altar between the two of them. And behind the Virgin, look at that glow of red. This is the visualization of the Annunciation, and it lines up really with God the Father coming from above. But also this Annunciation is carried, as I remarked last time, across the arch, by the physical architectural member of the arch. The Annunciation is carried from Gabriel on the left to Mary on the right-hand side. Let me show you a view of the south wall, the right-hand wall. Again, the one with the windows, the only one with windows in the Arena Chapel. And you can see some of the scenes again here, but particularly there is the flight into Egypt, which we'll be looking at. And I should emphasize that everything you see here is painted. What looks like marble panels below, that's all fictive marble, all painted by Giotto and his assistants. And what look like small sculptures set into niches here, that's all painting as well. As are all of the decorative bands, both horizontal and vertical. None of that is architectural. All of that is part of the painting. Let me turn now to the scenes of the life of Christ specifically. And it's a wonderful one to begin with, the flight into Egypt, which I showed you in the larger view. Once more, a dream plays an important part, an important role in this cycle in the Arena Chapel. We had the dream that the Virgin's father had. And there are similar dreams, of course, but this one was very important because when the angel appeared to Joseph in his dream, he warned him to take his family and flee into Egypt because Herod was seeking to kill the child whom he had heard would become king of the Jews. Not knowing who that was, he ordered the massacre of all the children under a certain age. And here is the flight from that event. It's an extraordinary image, one of the great inventions, pictorial inventions in Italian art. The monumental, hieratic scale of the scene. That look at the size of the Madonna. If she's much larger, twice the size of any other figure. If she stood up, an enormous figure. And we've seen something similar when we were looking at Nicola Pisano's The Birth of Christ, the Nativity, in which, again, the Madonna was much larger than other figures. Sacred figures, hieratically, are given larger physical scale. The figure here is one with the mountain. The little mountain behind her, only a mountain that carries such authority, such weight, and is blended together absolutely into the same pyramidal composition that is based by the ass who bears the Madonna and the child, and then the upward diagonals which move up above her head. And by the way, this same mountain or diagonal from the mountain leads us on. It's bathed in light here, and it moves on across to the right, across to safety. They're followed by some attendants, and they're led by an angel, of course. What's missing here, of course, is obvious to anyone who's looked at a lot of painted Madonnas. Her robe isn't blue, which is always the case, and the blue is missing except in two patches, both of them on the right leg, on the drapery over the right leg. And it's gone because it was painted in azurite, and it was painted, azurite is very expensive, so it wasn't painted into the wall in true secco, into the wet plaster, but on the surface of the wall in dry fresco, in secco as it is called, and therefore has long since disappeared. It's startling, and yet such is the power of the physical image, of the bulk of the figure, of the composition, that it hardly loses anything in its weight, in its human intensity. It does lose a great note, a punch of blue color. A lot has been lost of that blue in the sky as well, and for the same reason, as you can see. Well, what have they escaped by this flight? This is what they've escaped: the massacre of the innocents, and something quite remarkable. The pile of infants that are at the feet of these executioners testifies to the slaughter, even though there aren't many soldiers. This is a small, intense, concentrated scene framed by a man in a kind of pinkish robe on the left who pulls back in dismay at what he's contemplating, and on the right-hand side by one of the executioners in a sort of orange robe who has his sword behind his back, but you can't see it anymore because it's scraped off. It was painted secco, dry fresco, in gold, therefore on the surface, and that's scraped away. But you see his hand, and you see where the sword was. Mothers who hold their children trying to save them, or a chorus of mourning mothers behind, and they're in front of a baptistry, by the way. Extraordinarily, they are in front of a baptistry. Very poignant and intentionally poignant moment. And that's balanced with the balcony on the other side, a balcony from which Herod gives the command to slaughter the innocents. He points down. The blue sky is fairly intact here, and his hand is emphasized against that blue sky, and he orders this slaughter. There's an extraordinary moment in the middle. We have only two, other than the man at the right, two active executioners, I think. One in gray here, whose sword is being, and again it's largely gone, plunged, headed toward the child whose leg he grasps over here with his left hand. And behind him, a man, a very ominous figure in a gray hood, who holds a child. We see the child's left arm grasped by the soldier's left hand, and we see the child's head. And the head is right behind the right hand of the foreground executioner. And if you are to take your eye and follow around this circle made up of heads and hands, heads and arms, really, more to the point, you have the most extraordinary focus on cruelty and killing here that is amazing. Just everything overlapped and punching at one another. You hardly see parts of it, but the full intent is impossible to miss. And at the bottom are the innocents, the children, the naked children, piled up like so much cordwood at the bottom of this. And it is horrific. They're there in every possible attitude, and they're scarred. It's horrific to contemplate because it never changes. This is what goes on in the eternal cycle of this world, unfortunately, and it is always the innocent, the children, who get slaughtered. And we don't have to look far in the modern world to find its equivalent. I'm showing you the ensemble along the north wall now. And I won't read through all of these, but if I read through the central area in particular. You'll see some scenes you're about to see. One of them, the baptism of Christ. Another, the wedding at Cana, the first miracle of Jesus. Then the raising of Lazarus here. On the lower level, which is really the final part of the story, we go round once and come back to it, we have crucifixion, the lamentation over the body of Christ, the Marys at the empty tomb, and so forth. But this is the heart of the story, and we're going to continue with this middle band and the baptism of Christ. The baptism of Christ was already a time-honored composition in art before Giotto. It goes back to early Christian and Byzantine. The composition was set. These two rocky promontories, like little islands, little rocky shore pieces. On the left, we have a group of angels who stand and hold Christ's clothes while he is baptized. And on the right, Mary and Joseph watch as John the Baptist stretches out his hand above Christ's head, but note, does not pour water, as you expect in the baptism. The naked Christ is seen through the water, and both his nakedness and this transparency of the water is part of the tradition. Again, it's already established. He's naked, he's human, he's vulnerable, and here he is being baptized, not by John the Baptist himself in the literal usual act of pouring water on his head. The Baptist is a kind of intermediary here. Instead, when you look above, you get this great burst of light indicating an apparition, and from it, God the Father emerges in strong foreshortening. There's his head, his face looking down, and his right arm extended in a gesture pointing to his Son, baptizing him directly while he says, "Thou art my beloved Son." I might point out that the River Jordan rises up in a sort of curve. I don't know whether he's trying to indicate a kind of foreshortening, the far bank, the horizon line, or whether it's just a decorative swell of water. When I turned from this to the wedding at Cana, the wedding or marriage at Cana, as you prefer, Jesus is seen at the left. You usually want to look for him in the center, and so you have to be guided almost to the left. And there he is. The governor of the feast sits in the center. Mary sits next to him on the right. Again, her blue robe rather badly damaged. And although Joseph is not mentioned among the guests, this is a supper, a wedding that Jesus, his mother, and his disciples were invited to, but the Gospels do not mention Joseph. But Giotto, I think, has invited him because there's no other explanation, I think, for the bearded old man with a halo in the corner, unless it is Saint Joseph. Well, the wine ran out, and Mary called the attention of Jesus to the fact that the wine had run out. And so Jesus, on the left, told the servants, whom you see him talking to one of them, to fill the 6 empty stone pots, which are on the right, and there are 6, with water, and then to draw out a glass of the liquid and place it, give it to the governor of the feast. There it is at his left hand. When the governor first tasted the water, now become wine, he remarked that at most dinners, the host serves the good wine first, then the lesser wine. But thou hast kept the good wine until now. The line, of course, underscores the symbolic meaning of this miracle. It foreshadows the transubstantiation, the miraculous changing of Christ's blood into wine during the Christian Mass, the sacrament of Eucharist. I read the host's remark to mean that the new order brought by Christ is the good wine. The governor is seated in the center, and though he's not drinking a full glass, you see the color of it is at his hand, and his gesture is very similar to that of a priest's blessing. But Giotto is as fond of the genre, the everyday, as he is of with the miracle, I think. And in this case, he creates a wonderful touch, unforgettable touch of the steward, the head steward of the feast over here, who is sipping from these newly refilled jugs or transformed jugs with a very large flagon in his hand. He's getting a good taste with a puzzled or dubious expression on his face. And his corpulence is a crescendoed repetition of the shapes of the pots in front of him. Not an accident. It's emphasized by the similarity of their decorative striations. And the creases in his tunic echo them as well. To my at least, it's very, very funny. Immediately following this scene is the raising of Lazarus, another of Christ's early miracles. Lazarus was the brother of Mary Magdalene and Martha. He was very sick, and they asked Jesus to come to them and cure him. And by the time Jesus arrived, Lazarus had been dead and entombed for 4 days. He told Martha, in words that have become a central tenet of the Christian faith, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live, and whomever lives and believes in me shall never die." In the foreground of this picture, the two sisters of Lazarus have prostrated themselves on the ground facing Jesus in earnest of their belief in his words and in his power to restore life to Lazarus. They're presented as a single, unified mass. The large sloping rock in the background leads the eye from the upper right down to Jesus and also to his hand, which is isolated against that intense blue sky and also above the heads of Mary and Martha. But the slope simultaneously expands his gesture because it moves the other way as well. And it carries the miraculous power from his hand across the composition to where Lazarus stands in a balancing position, that is to say, in the similar place on the right-hand side as Jesus on the left. And that compositional balance is very, very carefully thought through. Lazarus is still shrouded. There is at the tomb, the vertical tomb is right behind him, by the way. The painting is divided down the middle between the group with Jesus, the disciples and sisters on the left, and those with Lazarus and the tomb at the right, divided between life and death. And Lazarus is flanked by two large figures, a bearded man on the left and a woman whose face is covered on the right. And behind her, by the way, a woman who covers her nose with a veil because, as Martha says in John's Gospel vividly, "By this time he stinketh." And you will find it in virtually every raising of Lazarus representation, a vivid reminder of mortality, one that Giotto and most painters of this scene include by the covering of noses. Striking man and the green here, this striking figure mediates between the two groups. He gestures toward Jesus. In fact, his hand goes into the blue area. It's as though he's passing the gesture on, as it were, while he looks intently at Lazarus on the other side. In the right foreground in the corner, two men are removing the marble slab that covered the vertical tomb behind Lazarus, while the barren rocky mount behind suddenly sprouts green trees as evidence of the resurrection. And in an especially memorable touch that is part of Giotto's genius, they don't know, the sisters, as we do, that their brother's eyes and lips are already opening, that life is already returning. I bypass several scenes now of the last days of Christ's ministry, including his entry into Jerusalem and others, and go directly to the violent and unforgettable scene of the capture of Christ. It's in the middle of the bottom tier on the south wall. The violence here is not so much in the clash of bodies as in the bristling array of staves and torches that radiate out of the mass of bodies converging on Jesus. There is a side theme in which St. Peter severs the ear of the servant of the high priest in his anger. Judas identifies Jesus for his captors by kissing him. In the Gospels, Matthew and Mark relate the plot, and Judas offer to single out Jesus by kissing him, but not of an embrace. And it's this embrace that is the brilliant moment in Giotto's invention, and the yellow robe that he embraces him with. It just lights up and focuses the center of the composition. And by this device, all attention goes to the two heads above that yellow robe, two heads in pure profile confrontation, contrasting the nobility of Jesus' profile with the low-browed brutishness of Judas. And Jesus meets Judas's eyes with an intensity that seems to stay the kiss. The kiss doesn't happen. And it's interesting that Luke, in his gospel, describes the moment differently. Quote, when Judas drew near unto Jesus to kiss him, Jesus said unto him, Judas, betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss? That's a significant difference. And I wonder if this is the gospel version that caught Giotto's attention, realizing, as he often did, that the moment before an action can be more dramatic than the action itself. That massive, sculptural, unforgettable scene is followed by 3 more scenes following Christ's arrest and preceding the crucifixion. The crucifixion is very different than most of the scenes in the Arena Chapel. It is severely symmetrical. It is frontal in presentation. The groups of the soldiers and tormentors of Christ on the right, and the group of the fainting Virgin Mary and John and the women on the left are utterly apart. The Magdalene kneeling at the foot of the cross and wiping blood from Christ's feet with her hair, which is not biblical, by the way, but alludes to the biblical story of her washing the feet of Christ and then drying them with her hair in an earlier episode. But here she cleans the blood from his feet. The cross bearing Christ divides the fresco absolutely down the middle. And then 10 small, grieving angels are disposed in the sky above, symmetrically, nearly symmetrically, one above each arm of the cross, one at each corner of the fresco, one under each nailed hand, collecting blood in a chalice, one collecting blood from the lance wound in his side, while its counterpart on the right side, the other balancing angel, bears his chest in anguish, and so on. This insistent symmetry, and the fact that the main actions of the crucifixion are completed and Christ appears lifeless on the cross, makes this scene more liturgical and more symbolic than narrative. The emotions are expressed, but with restraint. Astonishingly, only the centurion Longinus, here at the right, seen briefly here, who had lanced the side of Christ and been converted, he is the only one who looks at Jesus. No other eyes are on him at all. There could be no greater contrast with this static, relatively stoic painting than the Lamentation. Now, all eyes are on the dead body laid out in the foreground. Now, Giotto concerns himself with the unending human drama of death and the bereft who live on. It is Christ, but it is also every man who is dead, and it is every man who remains behind. In the foreground, the body is protected, as it were, from the too close gaze by 2 massive, anonymous blocks of figures who sit with their backs to us. At the far right, Joseph of Arimathea, whose tomb was provided for Christ, and Nicodemus, who helped in the deposition, are posed in front of a rock. On the high point of the rock, a dead tree highlights this scene. The rock begins its sloping descent, encountering the astonished, grieving St. John, who leans forward and throws his arms back, wing-like, giving impetus to the rocky diagonal. Below him, one of the holy women bending over Jesus, and below her, seated in dejection at his feet, is Mary Magdalene. And the crux of the emotion is reached at the end of that diagonal of grief, that rock where the Virgin cradles her son in her lap, supported by her knee, their 2 heads and their 2 halos placed in intense juxtaposition, a concentration of tenderness and sorrow. This tableau is backed by a tight cluster of standing mourners on the left. And then in the sky above, the 10 angels of the crucifixion, who were so balanced and symmetrical, return to provide their own unbridled lament in counterpoint to the long lines, the dramatic pauses, the resounding chords of these human mourners below. These angels dive and soar, pulling up in short spasms of grief that release the sustained crescendo of the unbearable loss below them. In the realm of the pictorial representation of great loss and unsustainable grief, has this fresco ever been surpassed? I doubt it. Though it's not the last painting of the narrative cycle, I feel compelled to leave it as last, except that I have not yet shown you the huge fresco on the inside wall of the entrance facade of the chapel, not part of the life of Mary or the life of Christ. Here is the interior looking the other way, finally, and we see the door wall and above it the Last Judgment, which takes up the whole wall between door and the window above. The Last Judgment. As the visitor may see the Annunciation when you first enter the arena chapel, so you certainly see the Last Judgment as you leave, and an announcement of the second coming and the final judgment of humanity. It's the same scene that we've seen carved in stone over the doorways of medieval churches, but now vastly enlarged. There is precedent for it in Byzantine art. He didn't invent this huge wall, but it is the first we've seen. It is an extraordinary image. It is not by any means Giotto's masterpiece in the chapel. I think he's much less happy here than he is with narrative scenes. He's less in his element. And it was probably painted in considerable part by assistants, but it is nonetheless the final essential part of this great cycle. For this is the end of history, as envisaged by Christian theologians. And in the Scrovegni chapel, a burial chapel, their final moment as well, their salvation or damnation, is presided over by this. Not that Enrico Scrovegni seems to have had any doubts. There he is, kneeling in the Last Judgment at the foot of the cross, and he's offering a model of his chapel, which is supported by a friar on the right, to the Virgin Mary, accompanied by a saint and an angel. Of course, he's positioned at the right hand of the enthroned Christ among the saved. But be that as it may, I must leave you instead with the image that may stay with you forever, the Lamentation. And while you look at it, I will remind you that Giotto belongs, of course, to the Middle Ages, as the painting of the Last Judgment makes abundantly clear. But when looking at the Lamentation, and so many of Giotto's other deeply felt images of humanity, we almost have to remind ourselves of that he is a medieval man, because he is also the most remarkable precursor of the Italian Renaissance of the 15th century. A century ahead of its time, he is one of its greatest sources. And one other matter of great significance must be mentioned here. Although we know the names of occasional earlier artists in the history of art, they remain essentially anonymous. With Giotto and his fame, which spread far beyond Florence and beyond Italy, something entirely new arises. From now on, the history of art is also the history of great artists. The Arena Chapel, almost at once, became a necessary part of an artist's education. Not only Italian artists flocked to see it from the beginning. They visited the Scrovegni chapel, Giotto's frescoes, studied them, copied them, emulated, assimilated them, paraphrased them, quoted them for centuries in their own art. From its completion until our own day, this chapel and these powerful, potent, memorable images remain also for viewers like us, art lovers, a place of pilgrimage, a place we must go to experience the passionate humanity of Giotto's paintings. Thank you for your attention.